So, politics of international identity and how that links into Zionism, and how Israel uses Zionism to amplify its desires and needs through geopolitics. So, the contents. I'm going to be going through political identity defined, the article which I've chosen to analyze from earlier this year, Zionism political identity, who are Israeli settlers, the application of international relations theory, and the reality of the situation. In this video, I'll be arguing that Zionism as a political identity movement drives Israeli settler violence in the West Bank by promoting the expansion of Jewish ethno-national state. Using the recent article, mapping 1,800 Israeli settler attacks in the West Bank since October 2023 by Al Jazeera, I will explain how Zionism shapes state policy and settler action through the construction of national identity, historical narratives, and the instrumental use of international political theories. To explain this dynamic, I will first outline Zionism's historical evolution, then apply theories from international relations, particularly Kant's democratic peace theory, and critiques of globalization and identity politics, to analyze how Israeli settler violence is legitimized and perpetuated. So, what is political identity? International politics of identity is how different groups identify themselves, whether it is by ethnicity, religion, gender, or political ideology. Through shared common beliefs or characteristics, people selectively place themselves into groups. In the case of my article, I will be discussing how Israelis have made their society and nation into an ethno-religious state for Jewish people only. The article itself says dozens of Israeli settlers, under the protection of Israeli soldiers, set fire to several vehicles and properties, injuring at least 21 Palestinians earlier this week. Now, this article is from the 22nd of January 2025, so it is a little bit outdated. These incidents highlight not only the escalation of settler violence but also its structural embedding in Israeli society, which is inseparable from the Zionist ideology driving territorial claims over the West Bank. Historical background of Zionism and political identity. Zionism emerged in the 19th century as a nationalist movement aimed at establishing a Jewish homeland in response to anti-Semitism in Europe. The 1948 establishment of Israel fulfilled part of this goal but also resulted in the displacement of Palestinians. This event is also known as the Nakba, or in English, the catastrophe. Zionism transformed from a secular nationalist project into a religious nationalist project. Zionism transformed from a secular nationalist project into a religious nationalist identity, particularly following Israel's occupation of the West Bank after the 1967 war. This historical trajectory matters because it frames settler violence today as not just isolated incidents, but as part of a long-standing territorial project to consolidate Jewish control over historic Palestine. The concept of Eretz Israel, or in English, Greater Israel, extending sovereignty over all biblical lands, provides ideological justification for settler claims in the West Bank. So, who are the Israeli settlers? The settlers are Israeli citizens living in Jewish-only communities known as Israeli settlements built on Palestinian-owned land that Israel occupied in 1967. These communities are fenced off from anyone who lives outside. The fences and walls that are built act as a border between Israel and Palestine. Despite the communities being on stolen Palestinian land, these settlements are part of expansions to solidify Israeli control in the West Bank through relocation of its people, ensuring that Israel maintains control within the West Bank. Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's longest-serving prime minister, has bolstered settlement expansion since he came into power in 1996. Undermining the 1993 Oslo Accords, which called for the freezing of settlements and mutually negotiated two-state solution. These settlements are a point of argument for Israel to say that because there are Israeli people that live in the West Bank, they are entitled to govern those areas and claim them as part of Israel. And on the left side, we can see the Israeli attacks of the settlers in the West Bank territories. You see a high concentration in Ramallah and Nablus and Hebron, these are major parts or major living areas and provinces within Palestine that many Palestinians live in. You can see the occupied East Jerusalem district, which is Jerusalem itself is shared between Israel and Palestine, it's called an international territory, but East Jerusalem, it belongs to Palestine and is meant to be governed by Palestine. But Israel, of course, they occupied it, removed the government, and they basically just govern in full. And on the right side, we can see the West Bank settlements. So the whole West Bank is Palestinian land and is legally internationally recognized as being governed by the Palestinian Authority. But the actual control is only in the orange. These orange parts are how much the Palestinian Authority actually can control. The brown parts are built up areas, so these are like big villages, big towns, major cities. And then everything in blue and purple, you can see that's what Israel controls. So even though the Palestinian Authority have international legal authority to govern the whole of the West Bank, they control only less than half of it, as Israel occupies the whole of the West Bank and governs everything, even in the orange areas. Israel has checkpoints within those areas, and they still govern who can come in and leave. As you can see, there are many gaps between them. So to get from one part of the Palestinian Authority to the other parts, they need to go through Israeli checkpoints. Now, to apply international relations theory to this, so first off, Kant's democratic peace theory. Immanuel Kant's democratic peace theory posits that democracies are less likely to go to war with each other. However, Israel's treatment of Palestinians challenges this theory. Although Israel is often described as a democracy, its exclusion of Palestinians from equal rights and sovereignty undermines Kant's assumptions. And the exclusion of Palestinians not only applies to people in the West Bank and that live outside of Israel, but also the Palestinian Arabs who live within Israel, because there is a population of Arabs that do live within Israel, but they're also denied their rights, and they are treated in an apartheid system as second-class citizens. Instead of fostering peace, Israel's ethno-nationalist democracy creates conditions for settler aggression and structural violence against the Palestinians. This shows how political identity rather than regime type alone shapes conflicts. Linking to the article I showed before, the settler acts described are not random but are enabled by a state that prioritizes Jewish identity over democratic equality, justifying settler violence as part of a national defense. The second part of international theory is globalization, identity, and exclusion. Theories critiquing globalization and identity politics argue that national identities are constructed and maintained through territorial control and exclusion of the others. Zionism exemplifies this. It constructs Jewish identity in relation to exclusive control over land, marginalizing Palestinians as the outsiders or the others within their land. Linking to the article, the settler attacks reinforce boundaries of identity. Palestinian presence is erased through violence to solidify Jewish territorial claims. Using theory alone can't always be applied to real-life situations because of historical events and political actors acting against the perceived norm. This leads to situations which cannot be predicted by international relations theory alone, but rather through the backtracking of history to identify how a society perceives themselves and the world they live in. Israel, founded under the collective trauma of the Holocaust, which caused the Jewish people to push for a Jewish-only ethno-state, and why they feel such a deep need for security. the constant suspicion that everyone is after them causes hypersensitivity towards security issues and creates a tendency to respond preemptively with highly destructive overmatch based on the smallest of suspicions. Although in many cases, especially when dealing with the Palestinians, security is used as justification for them to preemptively attack and be violent when there is no legitimate threat. To conclude, the settler violence reported in Al Jazeera's article reflects the deep entanglement of Zionist political identity, territorial expansion, and state-backed violence. By applying the international relations theories of democratic peace and identity politics, we can see that these attacks are not spontaneous reprisals but part of a broader project of ethno-nationalist consolidation. Understanding Zionism as a political identity project helps explain how Israeli policy enables settler violence as a tool of territorial expansion, undermining both Palestinian rights and regional peace.